We live in a pretty messed up time right now, to where everybody has been trained to trust the science, right? Everywhere you go nowadays, you are constantly bombarded with that exact same message. Trust the science. Trust the science. Scientists say, studies say, blah, 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 blah. All of that garbage, right? That is all over modern media everywhere you go. Like, it doesn't matter anymore. So, it begs the question, who the hell are these scientists that we're supposed to trust? Because it's interesting, when you start to see this message being thrown at you, very rarely are you given a name, right? Or if you are given a name, it's some ambiguous institute, right? Harvard says blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, Harvard what? Like, we know that school is corrupt. We know that school is literally just letting in anybody for political reasons. So why would you ever trust a school that is not based on academics or merit and instead based on politics and garbage? Why would you listen to anything they have to say scientifically? Right? And that's just one example of countless. They rarely, or the pieces of media that start talking about trusting the science, that's pretty much all they ever say. Just trust the science. There is this magical, scientific institution that encompasses the entire planet, that once they speak, you are not allowed to question anything they say. So when we start to look at something like history, and more importantly, ancient history, and we start to try and figure out when events took place on this planet, we run into a situation to where the scientists, in quotes, apparently already have all the dating answers you could ever want. And interestingly enough, all of these dating answers immediately and perfectly fit with the mainstream narrative. Very rarely will you ever find a situation to where the dates do not align with what mainstream history claims. And when that does happen, and there's no way that they can get around this, and they do release the occasional article about it, right? You always get some kind of a shock headline, and then you never hear anything about it again. Like, you'll hear something like, new Roman artifact might prove that the entire Roman history is completely different. And then the article is like one paragraph, and then you never hear any follow-up. There's nothing. It goes radio silent, and then the history is not altered given that new data. Right? Because sometimes, one of these discoveries slips through all the censorship, and and the public finds out about it. But of course, the mainstream is not going to make any changes. It's just like mainstream cosmology, right? Right now, NASA themselves has so much evidence that completely disproves the way they look at cosmology. And you constantly see articles, right? The James Webb Telescope finds new evidence that completely rewrites how stars are formed. You see that kind of an article like every 5 minutes nowadays. How many times are you seeing the mainstream version of cosmology being changed relative to the data? You are not. It is not happening. And the reason it is not happening is because there is already a status quo and you are not allowed to challenge it. A lot of bad things would happen to people in power if that were the case. So, for example, back to history, which is what we are going to focus on. If we start to follow the real evidence, and we actually altered our perspective of history relative to real scientific evidence, our entire society changes overnight. Everything changes. Everything that you know changes. Literally who you are right now would change overnight if you were to follow the evidence that we have of real history. Because real history literally makes us who we are. And if it's different, that means your life right now should be different. Your entire outlook should be different. But it's not. And it's not different because we're trusting the scientists. We are trusting the historians. They already have a pre-mapped out history that will not be altered relative to any scientific information. And none of it's going to change because they don't want you to change. It's literally that simple. That's it. It's a very simple psychological human function. It's a power grab and it's nothing else. Now, I'm not going to get all schizo. I know. It's just, but that's what this is doing. So, okay, all right. Within ancient history, we have a problem. Now, the mainstream is obviously an issue. That goes without saying. They're all corrupt. They're all insane. Okay, they're not all corrupt. They're not all insane. They're just, the vast majority of people have just been psychologically conditioned to believe in a very specific version, and they are not going to deviate. Right? They are part of the problem, but they don't realize they're part of the problem. Okay, that's a whole other topic as well. I don't want to get into that. I want to stay focused. What I want to talk about today, what we need to make sure that we understand today, is that when we are looking back at history, and it doesn't matter, I'm talking about history like 5-6 centuries ago and further back. And I don't just mean human history. I'm even talking about geological history. You like that geological history? Having an intrinsic understanding of geology is extremely important if we are to understand human history. Now, you might be wondering why, because, doesn't it take millions and billions of years for rocks to form and all of that garbage? Right? There is a disconnect between human history and geological history, even though there is an entire scientific study within history that requires knowledge of geology, right? That's archaeology, stratification. Right? When we find artifacts, for some weird reason, tons of these artifacts or entire cities are buried under geological structures, right? Or geological formations, let's say that. So if we don't have an understanding of geology, how are we going to understand what happened to all of these things that are buried, for example? Like, we got to figure it out. Now, unfortunately, the mainstream already has geology figured out as well. Right? They already know that, everything takes millions and billions of years to form and blah, blah, blah. And so, they already have it figured out, so nobody really thinks about it. Which is ironic, because when you start to look at human history and you see human history, such as something like, Greek or Roman structures buried under dozens, if not over 100 feet of sediment, that really does beg the question, what the hell is going on with geology? Because geology says things like, well, it takes millions of years for some sediment to build up, right? So 100 feet of sediment really should take 100 billion years. It's not like that, but you know what I mean, right? It takes dozens of millions of years for sediment to build up at that scale. So are we to believe that all of that sediment is, hundreds of millions of years that's on top of that Roman building? It's ridiculous. It's insane. But these are the contradictions that we find within historical science. And nobody cares. Like, nobody pays attention to this. Well, okay, it's not that nobody pays attention. In the modern day, more and more people are paying attention, but more and more people are also not really truly grasping what they're looking at. And one of the problems that we're running into now is, of course, the alternative mainstream. They've latched onto catastrophism, which is great, because that's obviously a situation that has happened within human history. But they're still holding on to mainstream geological purposes. So you find a really weird, hypocritical situation. Right? The Younger Dryas is the perfect example of the hypocrisy that exists in the alternative mainstream. They realize that there's some kind of a catastrophe had to have happened if to end the so-called ice age. But you got to figure out what that catastrophe is, and you have to make all kinds of excuses to end that ice age because none of it really lines up or makes sense. Now, of course, nobody who believes in the Younger Dryas, for example, ever stops and thinks, oh, wait a second, maybe there was no such thing as an ice age. Maybe the concept of an ice age is just wrong. right? There's no evidence for it. We don't have any hardcore proof evidence that exists. The only reason why we believe that exists at all is because of some mainstream, professor decided to start talking about it, and the mainstream believes it, so we must believe it too, right? That's the hypocrisy. The alternative side, they'll make the leaps of faith here and there when it comes to the evidence, but they still hold on to the mainstream version of so much stuff. And geology is one of the things that they still hold on to, right? The Ice Age has to be real. The scientists and the professors in the mainstream say it's real, it must be real, right? That the concept of it not existing doesn't even cross their mind. Another aspect that is contradictory in history and science are the dating methodologies that are used. And this is what I want to talk about today. Hey, that's not bad, 11 minutes almost, and I'm about to talk about the actual subject that I wanted to get into. Yeah, that's pretty good for me. Yes, that's not bad. A lot of people in the modern age, whether you are on the mainstream or the alternative mainstream, they believe that the dating methodologies that we currently employ are scientifically sound and provide accurate dates. There are supposed sciences, things like dendrochronology, right? People now believe that, yes, you can just count tree rings and you magically have the exact year and date something happened, and you have that date and you're done. And you can scientifically apply that to a historical period, and now you know the date. Right? They look at things like radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating is fascinating. There's a whole science behind that, obviously. Right? But the problem is that the vast majority of people have no idea how radiocarbon dating, or radiometric dating, I should say, because we're going to talk about the general radiometric situation, not just radiocarbon. But most people hear something like a radiometric dating methodology being applied to a very specific time in history, and they think that that's real science and that's providing a real reliable date. Now, the science is there. I suppose I shouldn't say it's not real science, but the dating methodology is hilariously ridiculous, and we're going to talk about that as well. Right? But when we have a situation to where, if you're a historian or a scientist and you are trying to find the date for something that happened in the past, and you are relying on modern dating methodologies, you are relying on garbage. Like literal trash. I mean, it's just absolute garbage. All of these dating methodologies do nothing for us. But because these dating methodologies have the weight of the authoritative institutions behind them, they can get away with saying whatever they want. And if you question them, you are the crazy conspiracy theorist. Right? If you question a radiometric date that supposedly points towards, the Ice Age existing or whatever, you will lose your job. You are not going to get published. You are not going to be listened to by the greater scientific community. Because, of course, the greater scientific community already has the answers. They've already figured it out. You're not allowed to challenge it. Well, we need to challenge this stuff, right? And the alternative mainstream is just as guilty as the mainstream, because they are using the exact same methodologies to prove whatever pet theory that they have as well. So if there's, some kind of a claim that some layer is 13,000 years old because radiometric dating says it is, then the alternative mainstream will also latch on to that because they think they're operating in real science as well. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is, we do not have any reliable dating methodologies that paint any kind of a picture with respect to anything that has happened for, say, the last, 300-400 years on back. So when somebody tells you that some rock layer is, 117 million years old, why? What are you talking about? How the hell do you know that rock layer is 117 million years old? Right? Or if somebody tells you that, oh yeah, there was an ice age, 12,000 years ago. How do you know it was 12,000 years ago? Why not 9,375 years ago, right? Why not 17,272 years ago? Why that particular date, right? Why, it's okay. So we need to talk about this because the ramifications of us truly not having any reliable dating methodology that can give us an insight into history means that the current dates that we are applying to all kinds of events in our past are simply wrong. And this is what is being hidden in our society. The true dates of true events that took place that altered everything on this planet forever and would ultimately create what we are currently living in today. And there are people on this planet who are well aware of all this. I am not, I am not making a discovery. This is well known by certain power structures, and they don't want the masses to know. So let's cover these dating methodologies, and let's see if we could find the issues with each of these dating methodologies so that we can set the stage to a point to where we understand that we can't rely on those dates. So if you believe in the Ice Age, and then in the progress of this show, or the process of this show, I destroy all of the dating methodologies that would prove the concept of an Ice Age, and then by greater extent a Younger Dryas. What that means is that anything based on those dates that people have used to build up a historical picture are objectively, scientifically wrong. And that means that we have to start eliminating a lot of stuff that people right now currently believe are real, and we got to get rid of it. Right? There's no such thing as an Ice Age, which by extension means there is no such thing as a Younger Dryas. Right? We don't know how old the pyramids are. We don't. Sorry, we don't. Right? All of these things that the alternative thinks they have figured out, they're wrong. They're scientifically wrong because we don't know. We don't know. And one of the main reasons why actually, I could probably say the main reason why all modern dating methodologies are wrong is because of a very simple problem that is ignored by everybody at least in the fields, and not known by everybody else. And that is the problem of calibration. I would argue very easily that most people are not aware that all of these dating methodologies, if they are going to be accurate, they have to be calibrated against something. You have to calibrate your system against a known known. This is very simple operations, right? You don't calibrate your scale by, guessing, right? You calibrate your scale against a standard. So what the hell are historians that are using these dating methodologies calibrating all of these supposed scientific methods against? Right? We do not have a standard. There is no standard in history. If we had a standard to calibrate against, we wouldn't need any of these methodologies because we would already know everything. It'd be done. So for example, when a geologist tells us, oh yeah, this layer is 112 million years old and it formed exactly 112 million years ago. What? How do you know that? Were you there? Do you have any kind of substantiated proof that shows us beyond the shadow of a doubt that that layer is 112 million years old? Do you have that? I mean, can you please show me? Please show me your time machine to where you went back in time and witnessed that event like you're supposed to, using the scientific method to make the claim that you are making. Guess what they're going to tell me when I ask them to prove that? They are going to try to tell me all these weird scientific gobbledygook garbage that is basically just a coping mechanism to say, well, the geological column builds up over X amount of time, so we extrapolate that against some equations, and then we take a lot of guesses, and then that's what happens, and then I have this, little nice pretty picture with multiple colored layers, and that tells us where all the years are of the layers. That is a geologist. That is literally how geologists work. They have no proof that a particular layer was created 112 million years ago. They don't know that because they were not there. they have nothing to calibrate against. They have also not witnessed a planet being formed in the way that they think a planet is formed, building up layers and whatever, I don't want to get started. They have never witnessed that. They don't even have, they don't have a control. They have nothing. They have no reason or right to make a claim about any of these dates. Same thing applies to historians. If we already know all the exact years of all these events, of all of these civilizations, we would not need to do radiocarbon dating. We would not need to do potassium argon dating. We wouldn't need any of this. Right? It would be irrelevant because we already know. What are we trying to do? But we don't know any of this. We are not testing this against any kind of a standard. That is the calibration issue when it comes to history and dating methodologies. If you look at something like dendrochronology, for example, right? What the hell is dendrochronology being tested against? Once again, we don't have any proof that any of these trees have existed exactly when and where they say they have existed. There's no science like that. A lot of people don't realize that. Let me give you a quick example of a problem with dendrochronology to illustrate the situation. Let's say, an Egyptologist opens up a tomb and he finds a wooden artifact. Okay, great. Now you would think, well, can't you just, radiocarbon date that or whatever? Yeah, you can. Let's do it. Let's go get the radiocarbon dating for fun. Let's do it. So they get their date. Let's just say 2,000 years ago is what that piece of wood comes back as. Okay, great. Does that mean that that person was buried 2,000 years ago? Or is it possible that that person was buried 300 years ago with an artifact that was carved from a 2,000-year-old piece of wood? How do you know? Right? You don't. That is the extreme gap that you find in dendrochronology. You cannot use trees to guess the age of some kind of a historical event. Right? It gets even crazier when you try to count tree rings. So the tree ring problem is hilarious because right now the vast majority of people believe that tree rings grow one ring every single year in every single tree, and that's all you have to do is count the tree rings, and then you have an age. Okay, there's one problem. That's not true. That is 100% false. Some trees can go seasons without growing a single ring. Other trees can have multiple rings grow in 1 year. So now what? Now what's going on? Now what do we do with that? Right? There's no reliable dating methodology when it comes to dendrochronology. To make matters even worse, of course, you have to try to figure out if the tree was even local. And of course, we don't know where every single local tree ever was on the planet because we don't know that because we can't calibrate it because we weren't there. So we have no clue where trees were, during what times. So we can't use it to prove anything at all. Dendrochronology is absolute garbage. And I've talked about that, so I don't want to... I wanted to focus more on the radiometric side of things. And more particular, potassium argon dating. That methodology... Because I haven't really talked about that. You know what? Let's talk about that. Because that methodology pisses me off. Because, so it's funny. So, interestingly enough, radiocarbon dating is actually getting, slowly but surely, it is getting the reputation that it deserves as being a less reliable way of dating an event. That is starting to happen. So what's now going on is that people are looking for other ways to date, geological formations or artifacts or whatever, because the carbon dating methodology there's too many problems with it. Now, nobody is openly talking about these problems because there is already too many dates that are based on carbon dating. So they are trying to basically have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to say, well, all the radiocarbon dating that was done, in the past few decades, that's all legit. But, now that people are questioning us a little bit now, in the more modern time, now we got to try to find something else because it's becoming increasingly difficult to defend radiocarbon dating or carbon dating, I should say. So they had to find something else. Now, potassium argon dating was one of these methodologies that popped up. Now, if you're not familiar with potassium argon dating, let me break it down for you so that we can see how ridiculous this methodology is. And this methodology, it highlights perfectly the stupidity of everything going on in the sciences. It's absolutely hilarious. All right, okay. So, potassium argon dating works like this. So, many rocks on Earth, especially volcanic ones, they contain a tiny amount of a radioactive form of potassium. And this potassium is called potassium 40. Now what happens is, with potassium 40, is that over time, it will slowly break down into another element called argon 40. And argon 40 is a gas. So here's the mindset behind what these scientists were thinking. When lava eventually cools into a rock, the idea is that any argon gas that was present would generally escape because it's a gas, right? It should just float away. So when the rock hardens, it should have no argon in it at all. It should only contain potassium, right? But as time passes, the potassium 40 in the rock will slowly start to turn into argon 40. Since the rock is now solid, the argon gas should, in theory, be trapped inside. All right, so this is the thought process that scientists came up with when they were thinking of how to use potassium argon dating for dating. Yeah, shut up. So here's what they do, all right? What they'll do is they'll take a sample of the rock and they'll measure how much potassium 40 is still in the rock. Then they will go and they will measure how much argon 40 has built up in the rock. Then what they do is they use they'll use the known rate at which potassium 40 decays, and then they go and they extrapolate how long it's been since the rock solidified. All right, so basically since the rock cooled, or since the lava cooled. Basically, the idea is that the more argon that you have stuck in the rock means that that rock has been around longer because the potassium in it has had that long to decay. All right, so on the surface, this sounds incredible. It sounds fantastic. There's no problems, very scientific, right? It's used in the mainstream, no issues. Oh yeah, very smart. We're all so intelligent now in the modern age. We can date whatever we want, whenever we want, right? We have all these crazy methods. And it does. It sounds good on the surface, right? But there's some caveats with the dating method. Right? Even in the mainstream, they have to acknowledge this. And so it can't be used on every rock that exists. Right? They generally use it for volcanic rock because, well, for the obvious reasons. If you have lava cooling, especially at the surface, it solidifies with whatever's going on there, and then you can use that to calculate and break it down. So lava, in theory, works great. But you can't use it on things like sand or dirt. You can't use it on sedimentary rocks. And you certainly can't use it on very young rocks because obviously a very young rock will not have had time for any of the decay to happen. All right. So there's issues. Now I've seen I've actually read some papers where people attempted to use potassium argon dating on sand to substantiate their claims for things like the Younger Dryas. And it had something to do with the whole Clovis people and all this garbage. But what did I just say? You cannot use potassium argon dating on sand. The reason why is simple. It's because that is a sedimentary situation. Right? It's a scrambled mess. Right? If you go grab a handful of sand, all of that sand is not going to have equal dates. Right? That's going to have a plethora of all kinds of stuff in that sand from God knows when. Right? You can't do that. You cannot date sand using potassium argon. So if you ever run into a paper to where somebody uses sand and potassium argon for dating methodologies, you can immediately throw the paper into the garbage, right? Because it's ugh. Maybe you don't throw it in the garbage, but this is what they do. This is the ridiculous. Okay, anyway, so you can't use it on stuff like that for obvious reasons. You can only use potassium argon dating in theory on a rock that is, self-contained. Let's say that. That is its own thing. And cooled lava being the optimal version of that. Now, I get it. Right now, you're probably still asking, well, what's the problem? I mean, if it captures, the potassium and it decays to argon, that's pretty scientific. Shouldn't that give us the exact date of whenever that rock would have been formed? Right? And most people will stop here and they will believe that the answer is a yes, and they will ask no scientific questions. They will not challenge the dating methodology, and they will move on happily using whatever dates happen to work for their particular version of history to support whatever the hell they want it to support. But of course, there are a ton of problems that the vast majority of people want to ignore when we look at potassium argon dating. And like I said, most people don't even know what questions to ask because nobody thinks about this stuff, man. Nobody wants to question the calibration. Nobody wants to question the quote-unquote science. They just want you to trust it, and they trust that other people are doing a good job when the reality is not. Okay, so what's wrong with it? What could possibly be wrong with such a process that sounds completely scientific? All right, so here's the first problem. And this really encompasses everything wrong with modern dating methodologies. And that is with the assumption that there was no argon at the formation of that particular rock. So basically what this methodology has to assume that it knows everything right off the bat. Same problem with all other dating methodologies. It assumes that it already understands the environment that this rock was created in. And by that, what it means is that no argon-40 was present in the rock when it solidified. Right? That's the assumption. There's no way any other argon could have ever been trapped in cooling rock. And if right now you're thinking, well, that's incredibly stupid, of course argon could potentially be trapped in molten rock. Yeah, you're correct. Congratulations. You just tore down all of science. With that one observation, you are now in the 0.001% of intelligent people on the planet. Here's your crown. You are king or queen or whatever. Right? That is where you exist now. Right? Nobody's thinking about this. They literally assume that they understand everything that was going on in history already, right off the bat. Right off the bat, this dating methodology, as well as the others, assumes that we already know what's happening. Which of course begs the question, why are we wasting our time, dating any of this stuff if we already know? Right? It's stupid. Absolutely stupid. Right, now the next problem would be very simple. Right? It's the problem of contamination from surrounding material. Right? Argon gas can migrate through rock layers, especially when it's under pressure and heat. This is a common geological fact. Nobody debates this, but it is completely ignored when anybody brings up potassium argon dating. Right? The contamination is a real problem. But once again, they assume that they already understand everything that was going on with that process. Right? It's ridiculous. Of course, the rock could potentially absorb not just a little bit of argon, but it could absorb extraneous amounts from the environment. Right? Who knows? Okay. Now, the next problem that we run into would be something like the loss of argon. So the problem here is that argon is a gas and can escape from rock, especially during heating events. Now, if argon can escape from the rock, the remaining ratio of argon makes the sample look even younger than it actually is. So when you think about it for 2 seconds, when you actually question their dating methodologies, it falls apart. And all I'm doing right now is bringing up very, very basic questions. These are very basic, intrinsic problems of geology, and we know they exist. But they magically go away once, some scientist is dating something and writing a paper for his buddies. Now, another problem that people don't want to discuss is the possibility that the rocks, argon and potassium, were essentially reset. So if you have that particular lava rock comes out, it cools, it hardens. What happens if it was heated up again and it goes through another metamorphic event, right? Or some kind of a volcanic activity that would essentially zero out the argon content. Right? What that would do then is that would cause a huge underestimation of the original age, or it would give us dates to a later event, but ultimately we would never get the original date of the original formation of that particular rock. Right? Things change. Stuff happens. Once again, these people are assuming that once the rock is created, it's done, it interacts with nothing, and it waits for them to date it. Ridiculous. Absolutely insane. Now, here's another problem, and it's one of the ones that is actually extraordinarily important to catastrophism in general, and it jumps into the assumption area on the mainstream side. And that is the weird problem of assuming a constant decay rate of these elements. Now, this gets a little weird because right now, mainstream science says that, they're stuck in uniformitarianism, right? Decay rates have been the same forever and they've never changed ever in the history of everything. That's basically the claim of mainstream science when it comes to dating. Now, we know that this is false because we know that decay rates can be altered. We know this for a scientific fact. But for some weird reason, when it comes to carbon dating or potassium argon dating or whatever, the decay rates have never changed. They have essentially always been the same. Right? They need these decay rates to not change because if the decay rates change, then that immediately invalidates everything that they do. Right? So they are assuming that nothing has changed, even though we know for a fact that decay rates can be altered. How do you like that? All right, and there's all kinds of, cosmic radiation can alter decay rates. Solar activity can alter decay rates. Right? Basically, there's a lot of cosmological processes that can alter decay rates. And what a surprise. That is exactly what we would expect to happen, by the way, during one of these cosmological catastrophes. We would expect during the Saturnian breakup, during the Venus event, during the zero event, we would expect to see these kinds of decay rates altered on Earth due to the kind of circumstances that the planet would go through. Right? But, of course, mainstream has no clue about this stuff. They know about decay rate change, but they just don't acknowledge it. So how the hell are you going to use any of this dating methodology to prove anything? Right? How are you going to use potassium argon dating to prove the Younger Dryas? How are you going to do that? You can't. You cannot. It is not possible. There is no way you can't do it. It is. All right. Want some more problems? Let's keep going. I just keep thinking of them. So for another example, and I probably should have started with this, one of the interesting things is that argon dating, potassium argon dating, can't date very young samples, right? You have got to have some decay period to take place. So essentially anything younger than 100,000 years, and this is what they acknowledge, like this is their date, is often outside of any kind of a reliable range of this method. So when we have somebody using potassium argon dating to prove something like the Younger Dryas or the Ice Age exists, even the mainstream doesn't agree with you. Right? Even the mainstream says, you probably shouldn't do that. But nobody says that out loud. Right? Just as long as you get the dates you want to see, right? Just as long as you can tune it and fudge it a little bit, you can write your paper and get some fame, and then you can get a show on Netflix, and then you can... You see what I'm saying, though? Like that's how this goes. Right? So nobody wants to talk about that. Now, one of the other assumptions that they also have to assume. Yeah, I know. I'm losing my voice. Shut up. Well, with respect to the alteration of the decay rate, you also have to assume a closed system. So you have to assume that the Earth literally exists in a bubble, is not affected by any outside sources or internal sources, potentially, and Earth is just permanently the way it is forever. And that's, they have to say that so that the dates can be reliable. Right? Earth has to be a closed system. Now, of course, we know for a scientific fact that the Earth is not a closed system. The Earth is part of a huge universe, right? This is what the mainstream loves to say. Oh, the Earth is just a little speck in space. Well, correct, it is. So do you honestly believe that the Earth is not going to be slapped around by all of the insane stuff going on in space? Of course it is. Of course it is. Earth is not a closed system. Earth is in a chaotic system to where all kinds of things can happen. And most of those things, we don't even know about them yet. Right? That's how insane it is. Now, I know. Ugh. Now, another interesting problem that we run into is argon or potassium argon dating has to do what everybody else does for calibration, because they still have to figure out how to calibrate, because they don't know, right? They don't know the true history, but they basically claim they do. So what? And the way they get away with calibrating is they look at other methodologies and calibrate off of those methodologies. So potassium argon dating will look to radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, all of these other sciences which have the exact same calibration problem, and they will calibrate off of them. So if a geologist has a calibration problem, why the hell would a potassium argon dating person calibrate off of a geologist's results? But that's what they do. They literally just go into a feedback loop with one another. Each one writes some kind of a stupid paper and the other one cites it, and then it just gains some notoriety, and then people start to take it as fact, even though there is no evidence for it to be fact. And this is how the calibration problem is circumvented by the mainstream. Well, a professor wrote a paper, it must be right. Let's calibrate off of that paper. Geologists are really smart. Oh, God. There's one other problem with potassium argon dating, and that deals with helium retention contradictions. Now, one of the interesting things is that studies have shown that rocks will still retain helium from decay that should have diffused out long ago if the rocks were billions of years old. So what this ultimately suggests is that argon and helium may not escape as predicted. And decay probably happened more recently or rapidly. Now that's a problem for uniformitarianists, because what that means is that you do not need millions and billions of years for any of this to happen. What that means is that the way we are looking at these dating methodologies, the way that we look at science in general, is wrong. And that's it. It's just wrong. There is no way around it. Right? And that's mainstream scientific studies. They brought that into question. So, all right, okay, check this out. Let me give you guys some examples of where potassium argon dating has failed. It's failed everywhere. I mean, let's be honest. It's failed absolutely everywhere. But here, let me give you some ideas of how bad this is. All right. Let's look at Mount St. Helens. Let's start there. That's a fun one. So here we had a situation to where basalt rock was taken from a 1986 lava dome that formed 6 years earlier before the test. Right. So we knew when the lava dome formed. This was a fact. It was observable. It was there. We know that. This sample was sent out for potassium argon dating, and the results were that the rock that had formed only 6 years before was 350,000 years old. So, lava rock that we had witnessed being created was dated to 350,000 years earlier. Other minerals in that rock, like amphibole, was dated up to 2.8 million years old. All right, 2.8 million years. So either Mount St. Helens did some time traveling, or the dating method is simply wrong. Now, there was a volcano over there in Hawaii. I think it was like a Hulale, something like that. Basically, what happened there is that fresh lava flows from the early 19th century that we knew were there, they were sent out for potassium argon dating. One of the samples gave an age of 1.6 million years old. A lava flow that humans had witnessed was 1.6 million years old. All right, so another one of those, there's another volcano over there to where they went over there and they grabbed some rocks from a 1959 eruption, and they dated those rocks to 22 million years ago. Right? They knew exactly when the rocks formed, but the rocks, or the test showed, and it proved scientifically, right? Trust the science, that the rock was 22 million years old. That's when it formed. So, the discrepancy of how messed up using trapped argon to try to date a rock, it's insane. New Zealand had the same thing happen. There was an andesite flow over there that had taken place in the mid-20th century, and that flow was dated to 3.5 million years ago. Right? Now, another good example, an interesting one, because I know this can get a little weird, but the lunar rocks were dated using this method as well. Right? A lot of people don't know this, and I know there's, did we go to the moon? Did we not? I'm not jumping into that debate, but one of the results, anyways, regardless of the situation, came back from those samples is that the potassium argon was all over the map. Right? It was insane. Some of the dates that came out of the tests were upwards of 28 billion years old. Right? So the moon is apparently 28 billion years old. I mean, come on, man. But it's funny, using if the moon samples are real, that really shows you how insane it is out there in space when you don't have an atmosphere, right? When you have nothing protecting the surface of a planet. Like, look at how the decay rates are being altered out there, right? It's crazy, right? You're gonna think that Earth hasn't been affected? You're out of your mind, dude. All right, so there's another one over, there's in California, right? So they took some fossil wood that radiocarbon had dated to around 40,000 years. And they found, and it was encased in some volcanic rock over there. And they used potassium argon to date that, and they found that the rock was 2.4 million years old, whereas the wood entrapped in that rock was only 40,000 years. Right, so both dating methodologies are just absolutely insane. Another good example is where they attempted to use Pleistocene basalts that were overlying some fossils. So what they did is they did some potassium argon dating on basalt layers that were sitting on top of fossiliferous strata to see, what the hell they would get out of it. And what they found was that the stuff on top was older than the fossils underneath. So basically what you would have to believe is that, the animals died and then magically extremely old rock appeared on top of these fossils perfectly formed. Right? So this is the problem. Right? Excess argon trapped during crystallization essentially will always give you false ages. Like always. Like it doesn't work, right? We are in an open system. There's no closed system here. This is why we are going to always forever get inconsistent results for rocks that we even know what the age is. It's going to happen forever because the reality is we do not know what we do not know. We do not have any real way of calibrating any of this. We do not know what was going on 2 million years ago. We do not know what was going on 2,000 years ago. And that's what people don't want to hear. And the reason why we don't know what was going on 2,000 years ago, at least in the detail that we really should, is because our ancestors were wiped out by a cataclysm. And not just one, but several, of varying destructive levels. These cataclysms likewise also messed with everything on Earth. And that includes decay rates. That includes it messing with all kinds of stratification. The catastrophes that our ancestors witnessed and some survived were on a destructive level that people are not ready to appreciate yet. There was no ice age doing things 10,000 years ago. All of the evidence for the destruction that we have happened relatively recently. And it happened over a course of several different major events, punctuated by minor ones. Right? This is the reality. This is what the history tells us. And the science also tells us as well. The fact, as I have just proven, that something like potassium argon dating is completely unreliable is an insight into the insanity that our planet went through relatively recently. So when you're out there reading and seeing dates, when you're cross-checking stuff, I hate to be that dude, but you can't use, if you have a potassium argon date that you are using to support a theory, the reality is, from a scientific perspective, it has to be discarded. Now that doesn't mean there might not be some kind of scientific value to it. That's not impossible, but the reality is you have to overcome all of the stuff that I just talked about. You have no choice. Anybody who believes that potassium argon dating is legit, I don't know what to tell you. All of the stuff that I've covered has to be overcome. And as it stands now, scientifically, that's not happening. So when we look at dating methodologies, regardless of if it's on the mainstream or the alternative mainstream, we have to get rid of them. We can't use them. And if we can't use them, what that means is that the current picture that most people believe happened of our history is simply wrong. And we got to move on. We just got to move on. Like right now, I'm going to shut this stupid video off because I got to move on. I got stuff to do. No one wants to subscribe. I'm going to